The waiting room was packed. 40, maybe 50 people. Mothers scrolling phones, workers slumped in chairs, a teenager with a sprained ankle propped against the wall. Nobody was watching the small boy in the corner. Nobody noticed when his lips began turning the color of a bruise, or when his chest stopped moving the way a chest should move. Nobody noticed when his fingers went cold and his head tipped sideways against the plastic armrest, like something had simply switched off inside him. Nobody except the nurse they called Deadweight. The nurse they'd been trying to push out for months. She saw it in 3 seconds flat. And what she recognized in that little boy's body wasn't something she learned in any nursing program. She learned it on a battlefield. Before we go any further, if you've never been to this channel before, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories we tell here don't show up on the evening news. They happen in hallways, in waiting rooms, in places where ordinary people do extraordinary things when no one is watching. You don't want to miss what's coming. And while you're here, drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from right now? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. Harlow County Regional Hospital sat at the edge of Deadweight, Montana, a mid-sized town that liked to believe it punched above its weight. The hospital had 4 floors, 2 surgical suites, a cardiac unit that had recently been renovated, and a reputation that administration worked hard to protect. It had good doctors, a decent trauma bay, and a culture that had quietly calcified over the past decade into something rigid and self-congratulatory. People who worked there long enough either climbed or got buried, and most people knew which category they were in within the first 2 years. Nurse Nora Voss had known which category she was in for a while now. She was 44 years old, had been a charge nurse on the emergency intake floor for 6 years, and was treated on most days like a piece of furniture that the department tolerated but didn't especially like. She wasn't flashy. She didn't push herself into conversations where she hadn't been invited. She showed up before her shift started, stayed until the handoff was clean, and did the kind of work that kept departments running without ever getting photographed for the hospital newsletter. She had short dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that didn't give much away, and a habit of standing slightly off to the side of whatever room she was in, watching, cataloging, filing away details that nobody else thought to notice. The younger nurses found her standoffish. The attending physicians mostly ignored her unless they needed something. Dr. Marcus Aldridge, the chief of emergency medicine, treated her with a particular brand of institutional contempt that he had never bothered to disguise. The kind that said you are useful in the way that a wall outlet is useful, and that is the ceiling of what I expect from you. He'd told her 6 months ago that he was considering restructuring the charge nurse rotation. We need people with current clinical instincts, he'd said, not quite looking at her. The department is evolving. She had nodded and gone back to work. What she did not do, what she had not done in 16 years of civilian nursing, was tell anyone what she knew, who she had been, the life she'd packed into boxes after her second deployment and driven away from without looking in the rearview mirror. That Tuesday in October started exactly the way Tuesdays usually started. The overnight shift left her a waiting room with 9 people in it and a whiteboard with 2 names already flagged for imaging. She read through the overnight notes, checked the supply closet situation, spoke briefly with the intake coordinator about a woman in Bay 4 who was asking repeatedly for a specific medication, and then settled into the controlled rhythm of early morning emergency intake, the time of day when things were still manageable, before the shift really opened up. By 9:15, there were 31 people in the waiting room. By 10:40, there were 52. A highway accident had come in through the main corridor about an hour earlier. 2 adults, both stable, brought in from a 2-vehicle collision on Route 9 near the eastern edge of Deadweight. The adults had been triaged quickly, and attention had moved on. What nobody had flagged yet was the 3rd person from that accident, a small boy, 7 years old, who had walked through the door on his own 2 feet, holding an adult's hand, appearing, to every person who looked at him, to be basically fine. His name, per intake, was Jackson Briggs. The adult with him was not a parent but a trucker named Gary Sorrell, who had been parked on the shoulder when the accident happened and had pulled the boy from a vehicle. Sorrell had a cut above his eye that was bleeding convincingly, and most of the attention in the corridor had gone to him. Jackson had been checked in, given a chair, told someone would be with him shortly, and then, as these things happen in busy emergency departments, had been absorbed into the volume of the morning and not looked at again. Nora was moving through the waiting room at 10:52, doing a visual loop, which was something she did every 40 minutes regardless of what the intake board showed, when she saw him. He was in the third row of chairs from the left, near the wall, sitting very still. That was the first thing. Most 7-year-olds in a hospital waiting room don't sit still. They fidget, they ask questions, they climb on things. They make themselves annoying in the specific way that healthy children do when they're bored and uncomfortable. This boy wasn't doing any of that. He was sitting with his back against the chair and his hands in his lap, and he was staring at the space in front of him with an expression that was not frightened exactly, but was the absence of normal. She slowed down. His skin was the wrong color. Not pale the way people go pale when they're scared or cold. This was a grayish pallor that sat underneath the skin, like something systemic. His lips had a faint bluish tint that was not quite visible from a distance but became unmistakable when she got within 10 feet. His breathing, when she watched for 3 full seconds, was shallow in a way that the body produces when it is working very hard to do something that should be automatic. She crouched in front of him. "Jackson?" He looked at her, his eyes tracked but slowly. "Can you tell me how you feel?" "Tired," he said. His voice was thin. "My hands feel weird." She picked up his right hand without asking permission. The fingers were cold. Not cool. Cold. She pressed on his thumbnail and watched the color go white, and then come back. And the capillary refill was wrong, too slow by almost a full second. She looked at his fingernails, which had a faint blue-gray tinge that matched his lips. She stood up and turned back toward the intake desk, and in her chest something had gone very quiet and very focused in the way it used to go quiet on approach. When the situation had been identified, and there was no time left for anything except action. "I need a gurney at waiting room station 3, she said to the intake nurse, Priya, loudly enough to carry. "Right now. And I need someone to get Dr. Aldridge." Priya looked up. "What's the—" "Now, Priya." She turned back to Jackson. She kept her voice level, kept her face calm, because the child was conscious, and she would not frighten him unless she had no other choice. "I'm going to have some people come over and take you to a room where we can look after you better, okay? It won't take long." He nodded, a tiny motion. "Your hands are going to feel warmer soon." She did not know if that was true yet, but she said it anyway because he was 7 years old and he was scared, and the least she could do was give him something to hold on to. The gurney arrived. 2 orderlies, a second nurse, and then Dr. Aldridge coming through the interior door with the expression he always wore when he'd been pulled away from something he considered more important, which was, in his view, almost everything Nora did. "What's the situation?" he said. 7-year-old male came in from the Route 9 accident, flagged as minor injuries. He's presenting with peripheral cyanosis, delayed capillary refill, abnormal pallor, shallow respiration, and altered effect. He needs to be moved immediately. Aldridge looked at the boy. Then he looked at Nora. "His intake record says he was assessed." "His intake record says he walked in under his own power, which he did. The assessment was visual." She kept her voice even. "His current presentation is not consistent with blunt force trauma. There's no visible injury that accounts for this clinical picture." "Carter," he said, and she noted, not for the first time, that he called her by her last name, the way people call a dog by its name when they're about to tell it to sit. "I understand you're concerned, but you're a charge nurse. Let's not catastrophize." "I'm not catastrophizing. I'm describing what I'm seeing. And I'm telling you we'll have a physician do a proper assessment. Then have a physician do a proper assessment right now, because this child has been sitting in that chair for over an hour, and whatever is happening to him is not stopping." They looked at each other. It was the kind of moment that happened in hospital hierarchies. The moment where the institutional weight came down on one side of the scale and the person on the other side had to decide whether to push back or fold. Nora had been folding for a long time. She had gotten good at it. She had told herself it was pragmatism, that you pick your battles, that the system grinds you down if you fight it constantly. But Jackson Briggs was 7 years old and his lips were blue. "Move him," she said to the orderlies, stepping around Aldridge. "Bay 2, now!" There was a beat. The orderlies looking at Aldridge, Aldridge looking at Nora. And then Aldridge gave a short, sharp exhale that communicated his displeasure and turned back toward the interior. "Fine," he said. "Run your assessment, but we'll be talking about this." She didn't respond. She was already moving. In Bay 2, she had Jackson transferred to the gurney, got monitors on him, and started pulling numbers. Heart rate was 94, which looked normal until you understood that in a child this small, in this kind of distress, a heart rate of 94 was the body compensating, holding the line by running the engine harder. Oxygen saturation was 91% on room air. That was the number that confirmed what she already knew. She held his wrist and took his pulse manually, the way she had been trained to do before monitors were the first resort, and she felt what the monitor confirmed, a rhythm that was slightly irregular. Not dramatically, not the kind of thing that would set off immediate alarms, but off. A subtle dysrhythmia that was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. She was looking for it. Jackson, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth, okay? Were you near anything that smelled funny? Like chemicals, or something burning, or something that didn't smell like normal air? He thought about it with the slow carefulness of a child taking a question seriously. The truck had stuff in it, he said. When the car stopped and the door opened, there was a smell, like when Dad uses something to clean the garage, but stronger. Did it make your eyes hurt? He nodded. A little, and my throat, but it stopped after a while. She straightened up. Her mind was doing something she hadn't asked it to do in a long time. It was pulling up information from a place she'd sealed off, cross-referencing symptoms against an experience base that had nothing to do with civilian emergency nursing. Peripheral cyanosis, delayed reflexes, cardiac irregularity without obvious structural cause, gradual onset after initial apparent stability, following chemical exposure. The smell of a solvent-based compound, strong enough to cause immediate mucous membrane irritation that then resolved. She had seen this pattern once before. Not in Montana, not in a hospital, in a forward operating base, in circumstances she had never described to anyone in this building, treating a soldier who had been caught in the downwash of an improvised chemical dispersal and had walked away from it looking basically fine for 45 minutes before his cardiovascular system began to come apart. She moved to the door of the bay and flagged down Priya. I need a toxicology panel, full panel, not standard, and I need someone to pull the incident report from Route 9. I need to know what that truck was carrying. Priya wrote it down without question. She'd worked with Nora long enough to know that tone. Aldridge appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, and he had the look of someone who had reconsidered the situation and arrived at a position he intended to hold. Nora, step outside for a moment. She stepped out. He pulled the bay curtain partly shut. I've looked at the intake report and I've spoken to the physician who did the initial visual on the boy. There's no documented concern about toxic exposure. The truck involved in the accident was a commercial vehicle. What was it carrying? That's being looked into. It needs to be looked into faster, Dr. Aldridge, because what that child is presenting with is consistent with delayed onset chemical toxicity. And if I'm right, his cardiac function is going to degrade over the next 30 to 60 minutes, regardless of how stable he looks right now. Aldridge studied her for a moment with an expression she'd seen on him before, the particular look he got when she said something that he couldn't immediately dismiss but didn't want to validate. What's your basis for that assessment? Clinical experience. You're a charge nurse, Nora. Your clinical experience is intake management. She held his gaze for a moment. Pull the Route 9 incident report, she said. Please, while we still have time. He didn't answer that directly. What he said instead was, I'm going to have Dr. Weston take a look at the boy. He's our tox consult for the week. How long will that take? He's with another patient. 20 minutes, maybe 30. 20 to 30 minutes felt like a long time. She looked at the curtain. She thought about oxygen saturation at 91 and a heart rhythm that was quietly doing something it shouldn't. I'm going to stay with him, she said. I'm going to stay with him, she said again, and went back into the bay. She pulled a stool to the bedside and sat where Jackson could see her face. She checked his SAT again, 90. She watched his breathing. She kept her expression neutral because he was watching her, the way sick children watch the people around them for information about how frightened to be. Are you a doctor? He asked. I'm a nurse. Do nurses know as much as doctors? She considered this. Different things, she said. Doctors know a lot about diagnosing. Nurses know a lot about watching. What are you watching? You, she said, to make sure you stay okay. He seemed to find this acceptable. He turned his head and looked at the ceiling for a while. It was during those minutes, 14 of them, she counted, that she did the things she had been trained to do in the absence of ideal conditions. She made do. She ran through the toxicological differential in her head, eliminated what didn't fit, narrowed toward what did. She thought about the soldier from the forward operating base. She thought about the compound, which had been an organophosphate derivative, not the kind you find on a hardware store shelf, but the kind that someone builds specifically to be dispersed and to be slow. She thought about the fact that Jackson had said the smell went away. That was how those compounds worked. The initial volatilization was irritating but not the dangerous part. The dangerous part was systemic absorption, the compound binding to enzyme pathways in cardiac and smooth muscle tissue, beginning a process of interference that didn't make itself clinically obvious until it had progressed far enough to be genuinely difficult to reverse. She took his hand again. Capillary refill, still slow, sat, 89. She made a decision. She stood, pulled back the bay curtain, and went to the medication station. She knew what she needed. She also knew that what she needed was not in the standard emergency department formulary for pediatric cardiac cases. It was in the secure pharmaceutical cabinet, the one that required a physician's authorization. She stood in front of that cabinet for 5 seconds. Then she went to find Dr. Aldridge. He was at the workstation near Bay 6, reviewing something on a tablet, and he looked up at her approach with the expression of someone who has been interrupted once too often and is deciding how to communicate that. His SAT is at 89, she said. I need authorization for atropine and pralidoxime. Something shifted in his face. Not acknowledgement. Not yet. But the expression changed. Those are organophosphate antidotes. I know what they are. I'm telling you what I need. That's an extraordinary leap from what you've described. I know. She kept her voice level. She had not raised her voice once in this conversation, and she was not going to start. I know it's a significant call, and I know what it requires. I'm asking you to authorize it. He stared at her. Nora, the toxicology consult will be here in Dr. Aldridge. She said his name quietly, precisely. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to give me 20 minutes to be wrong while his SAT is still above 85. Because if it drops below 85 and he goes into cardiac dysrhythmia, we are in a completely different conversation. The workstation between them hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped 3 times and then went silent. He looked at the tablet. He looked at her. This is against protocol, he said. Yes. If you're wrong, then I'm wrong and I take the consequences. She held his eyes. Authorize it. Another moment stretched between them, the kind that takes about 3 seconds in real time and much longer than that in every other sense. Then Aldridge exhaled through his nose, pulled his badge, and keyed open the secure cabinet. I want it documented that this was a charge nurse's request, he said. Document whatever you need. She drew the medication, returned to Bay 2 with a physician on her heels who had clearly been summoned by someone at the workstation, and administered the first dose with the kind of efficiency that comes from having done something under far more difficult circumstances than this, from having done it with inadequate equipment, in poor light, with incoming fire audible in the middle distance. Jackson Briggs lay on the gurney and looked at the ceiling. His oxygen saturation was 87. The medication went in. For the first 2 minutes, nothing visible changed. The physician, a young hospitalist named Dr. Cassidy, who had been called in as backup, stood at the foot of the gurney, watching monitors with the expression of someone who was not sure what they'd been pulled into. Then, at minute 3, Jackson's SAT ticked upward. 88, 89. At minute 6, it was 92. The cardiac trace on the monitor, which had been showing that subtle, worrying irregularity, began to smooth. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. Enough to see the intervention doing something. Enough to understand that the thing Nora had identified was real. Dr. Cassidy said something quietly that might have been okay, or might have been an expletive. Nora took Jackson's hand. His fingers were still cold, but the capillary refill was faster. Better? She asked him. He thought about it. A little, he said. The weird feeling is less. She nodded, kept her face neutral, set his hand down gently on the blanket. And then she looked up, because there were voices in the corridor that hadn't been there before, voices with a register and cadence that she recognized not from anything that had happened in this hospital, but from a different life entirely, clipped, purposeful. The specific way people speak when they are accustomed to operating in environments where words cost time they don't have. She looked through the gap in the bay curtain. There were 4 men in the corridor. They were wearing civilian clothes, but they moved wrong for civilians. Wrong posture, wrong awareness. The constant peripheral scanning that you can train into a person, but can't quite train out of them when they're off duty. One of them was speaking to Dr. Aldridge, who was gesturing in the general direction of Bay 2. The man Aldridge was speaking to was tall, mid-40s, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of physical stillness that in Nora's experience indicated either extraordinary patience or extraordinary control over what the body showed. He was not in uniform. He didn't need to be. He turned his head and looked directly at the gap in the bay curtain, directly at Nora. His expression didn't change, but his eyes stayed on her for a full 3 seconds. The kind of sustained eye contact that in civilian life would be unusual, but in certain other contexts was simply the way you confirmed what you were looking at. Then he said something to Aldridge that Nora couldn't hear. Aldridge's expression shifted into something she couldn't quite read from this distance. The tall man turned back toward the corridor and said something to the others, and they changed direction, moving not toward the entrance, not toward the main desk, but toward Bay 2, toward her. Nora straightened up. She checked Jackson's monitor one more time, sat 93, heart rate normalized, rhythm clean. He had closed his eyes. His breathing was slower, easier. The breathing of something that had been fighting and was now, temporarily, not fighting. She stood at the foot of the gurney and faced the curtain as it was pulled aside. The tall man with the gray hair stepped in. He looked at Jackson for a moment, then he looked at her, and this time the examination was different, systematic, the way you look at something when you're building a complete picture rather than making a first impression. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was flat and controlled. "Are you the nurse who made the call on this patient?" "I am." He nodded, once. "What treatment did you administer?" "Atropine and pralidoxime." A pause. "What made you choose those agents?" She looked at him for a moment. In the corridor behind him, she could see Aldridge standing with his arms crossed, watching. "I recognize the symptom cluster," she said. "Symptom cluster consistent with what?" She held his gaze. "With delayed onset organophosphate toxicity following a low-level chemical exposure event." The man with his gray hair was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn to recognize that?" he said. It was not a casual question. The way he said it, the specific way, with the specific weight, told her that he already had some idea of the answer and was asking because he needed to hear it from her. She was aware of Aldridge in the corridor. She was aware of the young physician near the monitor. She was aware of the intake nurse who had followed the small crowd and was standing at a slight remove, watching. She was aware that the answer she was about to give would change things. She had spent 16 years making a specific choice, the choice to fold that part of herself away, to present the surface that the world expected, to be Nora Voss, the charge nurse from Deadweight, rather than the other thing she had been. She had made that choice for reasons that had made sense to her at the time, and that she was not sure still made sense now. The man with the gray hair waited. "I didn't learn it here," she said. His expression didn't change, but something in the room did. "No," he said quietly. "I don't imagine you did." And in the corridor, she heard Aldridge take a breath, the sound of a man who has just understood that the conversation he thought he was controlling had been about something else entirely. His name, she found out later, was Agent Dale Fourier, not military, as she'd initially read him, but federal, which explained the civilian clothes and didn't explain the way he carried himself, which was military down to the marrow. He didn't introduce himself in the bay. He asked his questions, heard her answers, and then stepped back out into the corridor with the quiet authority of someone who has already decided what the next hour looks like and is simply executing it. One of the men with him stayed in the corridor outside Bay 2. Another disappeared in the direction of the main entrance. The third went to the intake desk and began speaking to Priya in a low, even voice that made Priya's expression go from curious to careful very quickly. Nora stayed with Jackson. She had nowhere else to be and no intention of going anywhere. His sat was holding at 93. His color was still wrong but improving. The gray underneath the skin was retreating, slowly, the way color comes back to a bruise in reverse. He had fallen into a shallow sleep, which his body needed and which she counted as a reasonable sign. She sat on the stool beside the gurney and watched his breathing and kept her hand still in her lap, which was harder than it looked. Doctor. Aldridge came into the bay at 11:47. He didn't have his tablet. He wasn't looking at his phone. He came in and stood at the foot of the gurney and looked at the monitors for a moment, and then he looked at her, and for once his expression was unreadable in a different way than usual. Not dismissive, not calculating, but something closer to uncertain, which was not a look she had seen on him before. His numbers are stabilizing, he said. Yes. The medication worked. Appears to. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the curtain, she could hear Fourier's voice, unhurried, precise, speaking to someone she couldn't identify. The federal agents want the incident report from Route 9, Aldridge said. They've also asked for everything we have on the patient. Intake, assessment, treatment log. Okay. They want to speak with you again. I assumed. He looked at her for another moment, and she could see him working towards something he wasn't sure how to say, which was unusual because Aldridge was generally very sure how to say things. Nora, he started. I'll be available when they're ready, she said, not unkindly. But I'm staying with him until someone I trust is covering him. The word trust landed with a small precision between them. Aldridge heard it. He didn't respond to it directly, which was probably the right call. I'll send Priya, he said. He left. Priya arrived 4 minutes later, and Nora gave her a handoff that was specific and complete. Medication timing, vitals baseline, what to watch for, when to escalate, and to whom. Priya listened with the focused attention she brought to everything and didn't ask any of the questions she was clearly holding, which Nora appreciated. Call me if anything changes, Nora said. Anything. I will. Nora looked at Jackson one more time. His chest was rising and falling with something closer to a normal rhythm. His hands were less cold than they'd been. She had done what she could do, and now she had to go do the other thing. The thing she was less practiced at and liked significantly less. She went out into the corridor and found Fourier. He had set up, apparently without asking anyone's permission, in the small conference room off the main hallway that was usually used for family consultations. The table that normally held a box of tissues and a water pitcher now had a laptop open on it and a two-way radio that was cycling through a quiet frequency. One of his colleagues was there, younger, with a close-cropped beard, and the posture of someone recently out of a service branch. The door was open. Fourier looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Ms. Voss, come in. Please close the door. She did. She sat in this chair across from him, which was on the family side of the table, the side where people sat when they were receiving information rather than delivering it. She noticed this and chose not to move. I'm going to tell you what we know, Fourier said, and then I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'd like your answers to be as complete as possible. Is that agreeable? Depends on the questions. He accepted this without any visible reaction. Fair enough. The truck involved in the Route 9 accident was registered to a commercial freight company out of Billings. The manifest listed industrial cleaning equipment. That was not accurate. She waited. We've had the wreck site under assessment for the past 90 minutes. The cargo included containers of a compound that doesn't appear in any legitimate industrial supply chain we can locate. Our people are identifying it now, but based on your treatment choice, I suspect you may have a working hypothesis. I have a hypothesis, she said. I don't know if it's right. Tell me anyway. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. The symptom pattern in that child is consistent with low-level exposure to a volatile organophosphate variant. Not a common agricultural compound. The cardiac involvement is specific, and the latency window is too long for standard organophosphate poisoning. It behaves more like a modified agent, something engineered for a particular dispersal profile. She paused. The immediate irritation resolves and the exposure looks survivable. Then the systemic effects begin. Fourier was watching her with the same flat, systematic attention he'd brought to the bay. You have field experience with agents of this type, he said. It was not a question. I have experience with one incident involving a compound with a similar mechanism, she said. I'm not going to claim they're the same thing, but the presentation was close enough that I wasn't willing to wait for the toxicology consult. Where was that incident? She held his gaze for a moment. I served 2 deployments as a combat medic, she said. The second one is not something I discuss. I'm not asking you to discuss it, Fourier said. I'm asking you to confirm that your experience base includes chemical exposure events in a military context. Yes. He nodded. He turned to the younger agent who had been taking notes on a tablet and said something in a low voice. Then he turned back to Nora. The compound we're dealing with is not supposed to exist outside of 3 facilities in the United States, he said. It's a controlled substance under provisions that most people in this building have never heard of. The fact that it was on a commercial truck on a Montana state highway is a significant problem. Nora sat with that for a moment. How many people were near the wreck site, she said. First responders, 2 other motorists who stopped, the driver of the other vehicle. Have they been assessed? They're being contacted now. He paused. Because of you, we knew what to look for. We wouldn't have known that for another several hours if you hadn't flagged the boy. She didn't respond to that. It wasn't false modesty. It just wasn't the part of the situation she was focused on. Are there more containers? She asked. From the truck? We're working on that. Which was not a no. She felt something cold settle at the base of her spine. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of scale. The specific feeling of understanding that the thing in front of you is larger than it first appeared, and that the first appearance had already been significant. I need to get back to my patient, she said. We may need to speak with you further. I know where to find you. She stood up. Fourier stood up as well, which she noticed. The old-fashioned instinct, or possibly something else. He held the door. Ms. Voss, he said, as she moved past him. The authorization for the medication, that was a significant call to make. Yes, she said. It was. She went back to the floor. What she found there was different from what she'd left. The waiting room had the specific energy of a space where something has shifted without anyone making an announcement. People were looking at their phones with an alertness that was different from idle scrolling, checking something. The television mounted in the corner had been switched, by someone, from the daytime programming that usually ran to a local news feed, and there was a chyron running at the bottom of the screen that she caught in pieces as she moved. Hazmat response, Route 9, details developing. Priya met her halfway down the corridor. Jackson's stable, Priya said, but there are 2 more patients coming in from Route 9, first responders, both presenting with, she checked her notes, eye irritation, nausea, elevated heart rate. Same exposure. That's what the paramedics are saying. Nora thought fast. We need to treat them under the same protocol. Get Aldridge to authorize the antidote stock now, before they arrive, because once they're in the bay is not the time to have the authorization conversation. He's not going to like that. No. She was already moving toward the supply station. But I'd rather he be angry now than have to explain a delay later. She found Aldridge at the workstation and gave him 30 seconds of information without pauses and without apology. He listened. His expression went through several phases, none of which she particularly cared about, and ended somewhere in the vicinity of reluctant agreement. I'll authorize it, he said, but I want a physician in the bay for every administration, not a nurse making unilateral calls. Fine. I'm serious, Nora. I heard you. She looked at him. Are we going to stand here discussing it, or are we going to prepare for 2 incoming patients with chemical exposure? He authorized the stock. The 2 first responders, a paramedic named Torres and a firefighter named Weiss, arrived 8 minutes later in separate ambulances. Torres was worse, with more pronounced cyanosis and a heart rate already showing the irregular signature she'd seen in Jackson. Weiss was earlier in the progression, still relatively ambulatory, but with the look in his eyes that she recognized. The look of someone whose body is beginning to do things they don't have words for. She worked both bays in rotation, with Aldridge and Cassidy present as required, and she did not think much about the political geography of the department while she was doing it because there was no bandwidth left for anything except the work. This was something she had always been able to do. Narrow down to the task, excise everything irrelevant, operate inside the problem until the problem was smaller. Some people found emergency medicine overwhelming for exactly the reason she found it clarifying. It removed the noise. Torres's SAT dropped to 86 before the medication began to take hold, and there were 4 minutes in Bay 3 that were not clean or smooth in any sense. Torres was conscious and frightened and asking questions in both English and Spanish, and the physician present was Cassidy, who was doing his best but whose hands were not as steady as they could be, and Nora was working around him without appearing to work around him, which required a specific kind of invisible efficiency she had developed over many years and would not have been able to explain if asked. It worked, eventually. It always cost something. At 1:20 in the afternoon, all 3 patients from Route 9 were stable. Jackson was sleeping. Torres was sitting up and drinking water with an expression of exhausted disbelief. Weiss had called his wife twice. Nora went to the break room, poured coffee that had been sitting since morning, and drank half of it standing at the counter. Her hands were not shaking. They almost never shook. This was not a virtue. It was just a physical fact about her that she had stopped finding remarkable. She was on the second half of the coffee when Dr. Aldridge appeared in the doorway. He came in. He didn't sit down. "The federal agents want a full debrief," he said, "of everything that happened today, starting from the moment you identified Jackson in the waiting room. I'll give them whatever they need. They're also asking about your background." He paused. "Your military background." She set down the coffee cup. "That's my information to share," she said. "Not the hospital's." Nora, is there a legal obligation for the hospital to disclose it?" He was quiet for a moment. "No, not that I'm aware of." "Then it's my information." He looked at her with an expression that had lost most of the components of his usual condescension and was left with something that she might, in a generous reading, have called complicated. "You should have told me," he said, "about your background." "I didn't think it was relevant." "Clearly it was." She picked up the coffee cup again. "With respect, Dr. Aldridge, the relevant thing today was not my background. It was a 7-year-old boy sitting in our waiting room turning blue. I told you he needed immediate attention. You told me to wait for the toxicology consult." She took a sip of the bad coffee. "My background didn't change what I was seeing. It just meant I knew the name for it." He stood there for another moment with the expression of someone who has something more to say and has decided not to say it today. "The hospital administrator is coming in," he said finally. "Marlene Oakes. She'll want to speak with you as well." "Great," Nora said, without particular enthusiasm. He left. She finished the coffee, rinsed the cup, and went back to the floor. The afternoon moved in the disjointed way that afternoons move when something significant has happened in a place that is trying to continue functioning normally. The waiting room was less full. Word had spread, as it always does, and some non-urgent cases had self-selected out. The 2 federal agents who weren't Fourier maintained a presence near the entrance without being conspicuous about it, which was a skill. Priya had the look of someone who had been told more than usual and was being professional about not discussing it, which Nora appreciated. She was doing a chart update at 2:45 when she heard the voices in the corridor. Not Fourier's voice, different. Multiple voices, raised slightly, with the specific register of a disagreement that has moved past its civil phase. She looked up from the workstation. Coming down the main corridor was a woman she didn't recognize, mid-50s, well-dressed in the way that hospital administrators are well-dressed, with the purposeful walk of someone who is prepared for this conversation. This was presumably Marlene Oakes, and she was flanked by a man in a suit who was not a federal agent and who was carrying a leather folio under his arm the way attorneys carry things. Behind them, looking like he was navigating between 2 fronts simultaneously, was Aldridge. The woman, Oakes, was speaking to Fourier, who had appeared from somewhere and was walking with them. She was not quite arguing with him, but the conversation had the shape of one. "Appreciate that there are federal considerations here, Agent Fourier, but this is my hospital, and the personnel decisions and the patient privacy framework are—" "I understand," Fourier said. "I'm not asking you to compromise either of those things. I'm asking for a brief window to—" "You're asking for access to a member of my staff for an open-ended conversation about matters that, as far as I can tell, fall well outside your stated jurisdiction. Mrs. Oakes, Administrator Oakes. Administrator Oakes." If Fourier found this irritating, he didn't show it. 3 people who came through this emergency department today survived a chemical exposure that could have killed all of them. The staff member you're protecting was the reason they survived. I'd like to understand how she identified the exposure and what she knows about the compound involved, because that information may be directly relevant to an ongoing investigation. Oakes stopped walking. Nora, from 30 feet away, could see the calculation happening. The administrative weighing of liability and exposure and media optics and federal pressure, all of it running simultaneously behind a face that was composed and professional. "She can speak with you voluntarily," Oakes said, "if she chooses to. We're not obstructing anything, but she will have legal counsel present, and the conversation will be limited to—" "I don't need legal counsel," Nora said. Everyone looked at her. She had not meant to say it from 30 feet away. It had just come out, because the conversation had reached a point where her standing at a distance seemed more complicated than her simply being part of it. She walked toward them. Fourier watched her come. The attorney, she was right about that, the folio gave it away, was looking at her with an expression of professional concern. Oakes's face was doing the thing that administrators' faces do when something has departed from the plan. "Ms. Voss," Oakes said carefully, "we were just discussing—" "I heard." She looked at Fourier. "I'll talk to you, without counsel, if that's how you need it." She looked at Oakes. "This is not obstruction, and it's not a personnel issue. It's a woman answering questions about a medical event she was present for." She paused. "Is there a problem with that?" Oakes looked at Aldridge. Aldridge looked at the middle distance. "No," Oakes said, in a tone that meant yes, but not yet. "No problem." Nora went back to the conference room with Fourier. This time the younger agent was not present. Fourier closed the door, and there was a different quality to the room. The earlier session had been introductory, the establishing of a baseline. This one felt like they were getting to the actual thing. "I need to ask you something specific," Fourier said. "Okay. The compound, your hypothesis about its origin, when you said it behaved like a modified agent, modified how?" She thought about how much to say. Then she thought about Torres in Bay 3 and the 4 minutes when it could have gone the other way, and she said the full thing. "Standard organophosphate compounds, the ones used in agricultural settings, hit fast and they hit hard. The symptom onset is quick. What I saw in Jackson and then in Torres was a slower cascade. The initial exposure causes enough irritation to be noticed, then it appears to clear. The person feels like they're through the worst of it. Then the systemic effect begins, cardiac, respiratory, 30 to 90 minutes later." She looked at him steadily. "The latency is deliberate. A compound engineered with that profile is designed so that the exposure event and the medical event are separated, so they look unrelated." Fourier was very still. "You said you saw this once before." "Something similar, enough that I recognize the pattern." "In what context?" "I told you, the second deployment." "Can you be more specific?" She looked at the table. She had not thought about that particular week in a long time. She had a practiced ability to not think about it, which she had cultivated with intention. But the details were there, and they came back with the specificity that trauma always comes back with, not gradually, but all at once, the way a light turns on. "There was a village," she said. "Outside a forward operating base I can't name. A group of civilians came in, family, I think, or neighbors, all with the same presentation. No obvious injury, but systemic failure beginning around the 90-minute mark. We lost 2 of them." She paused. "The cause was never officially confirmed. It was attributed to contaminated water." "But you didn't think it was contaminated water?" "No." "What did you think it was?" She looked at him. "I thought someone was testing something," she said. "I thought those people were data points." The word landed in the quiet room and stayed there. Fourier's expression didn't shift, but his stillness changed quality, became more deliberate, the way stillness does when something has been confirmed that couldn't previously be confirmed. "Ms. Voss," he said, "the freight company whose truck was on Route 9 has 3 other vehicles currently in transit. We don't know their cargo. We don't know their destinations." He looked at her directly. "Is there anything else you can tell me about what you observed today? Anything at all, that might help us identify what we're dealing with and where it came from?" She thought. She thought about Jackson's fingernails and the color they'd been when she'd found him. She thought about Torres asking questions in 2 languages while his heart did something it wasn't supposed to do. She thought about a village she wasn't supposed to remember and 2 people she wasn't supposed to have lost. "The modification that creates the latency window," she said slowly. "It's not easy. It's not something you do in a basic lab with off-the-shelf materials. It requires knowledge of enzyme pathway interference at a very specific level." She met his eyes. "Whoever made what was in that truck has done this before. They know exactly what the compound does because they've watched it do it. The radio on the table crackled. The younger agent's voice came through, clipped and terse. "Fourier, we've got a problem. One of the other trucks. We found it. It's not the cargo that's the issue." Fourier picked up the radio. "What is it?" A pause on the other end. The kind of pause that precedes information that reconfigures the shape of a situation. "The driver," the voice said. "He's one of ours. Federal ID. We're trying to confirm which division." The room went very quiet. Fourier looked at Nora. She looked at him. "Stay here," he said, and moved for the door. She did not stay there. She followed him into the corridor, and she was 3 steps behind him when he pushed through the emergency department doors into the ambulance bay, where the afternoon light was flat and cold, and the radio in his hand was broadcasting a conversation that involved too many voices speaking over each other and not enough answers to the questions being asked. She stood in the ambulance bay and listened. And what she understood, assembling it from fragments the way she had been trained to assemble information in conditions of incomplete data, was this. Somewhere between Deadweight and a location she couldn't yet identify, a federal employee had been driving a truck carrying a compound that wasn't supposed to exist, and the people who had sent him were not the people who were supposed to be in charge of such things, which meant that what had happened on Route 9 was not a transportation accident, which meant that Jackson Briggs, 7 years old, who was sleeping in Bay 2 with his oxygen saturation finally at a number that allowed her to breathe, had not been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been the wrong kind of witness, and so, she realized, had she. Fourier was already on his radio, moving toward the far end of the ambulance bay with the focused speed of someone who doesn't run because running signals panic, and panic costs you the next 30 seconds. Nora stayed 2 steps behind him, close enough to hear, far enough that he couldn't easily tell her to go back inside. The voice on the radio belonged to the younger agent, Reyes, she'd heard someone call him, and he was feeding information in short bursts from what sounded like a vehicle, road noise underneath the words, the occasional compression of a bad signal. "Driver's name is Garrett Polk, Federal Contractor ID, issued 18 months ago through a procurement office in Denver. We ran it twice. It's real." "Which division?" Fourier said. "That's the problem. The office it's issued through. We can't reach anyone there. Phones aren't going to voicemail. They're just not connecting." Fourier stopped walking. He turned slightly, not toward Nora but not away from her either, processing. "Where's the truck now?" "Secured. We've got hazmat on site." "But Fourier, there were 4 containers in the cargo hold. We only found 3 intact." A pause. "One is missing. Either it wasn't loaded or it came off somewhere between Billings and the Route 9 site." The afternoon light in the ambulance bay was going flat and pale. Somewhere on the access road, a supply truck was pulling in, oblivious, and Nora watched it maneuver around a parked ambulance with the slow carefulness of a driver who didn't know what was happening 20 feet away. "Get the route mapped," Fourier said. "Every stop, every slowdown, traffic cameras, way stations, anything." "Working on it." He clicked off. He turned and looked at Nora, and for the first time since she'd met him, which was, she noted, only about 3 hours ago, his expression had something in it beyond flat professional attention. Not alarm. Something more controlled than alarm. The look of someone who has received a piece of information that changes the shape of the problem and is already building a new shape in real time. "You should go back inside," he said. "One container unaccounted for," she said. "If it's compromised, if it's leaking somewhere along that route, the latency window means people who were exposed 2 hours ago are going to start presenting right now." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "Does Deadweight General have a poison control liaison?" "I don't know." "I do." "They don't." She held his eyes. "The closest facility with a toxicology unit capable of handling this volume is in Missoula. That's 2 hours and 15 minutes. If you have more exposure events between here and Billings, the hospitals along that corridor are going to get patients they can't identify and can't treat, and they're going to lose people before they understand what's happening." She paused. "Unless someone tells them what to look for." He stood there in the cold ambulance bay air, and she could see him calculating what she was, what she knew, what the risk profile of including her further looked like against the risk profile of not including her. "That's not a conversation you can have through normal medical channels," he said. "The compound is classified." "Classified compounds still kill people when they get into the air," she said. "You don't have to tell them what it is. Tell them what it does. That's enough. Another beat. Then he said, "Come with me." They went back inside past the intake desk where Priya was managing 3 incoming patients simultaneously and didn't look up, past the corridor where Oakes and the attorney were still waiting with the patient exhaustion of people who have prepared for a confrontation that keeps not happening, and into the conference room where Fourier sat down at the laptop and started pulling up a mapping interface that was not Google Maps. "I need you to identify the symptom cluster in writing," he said. "Clinical language. What a first responder or ER intake nurse would see in a patient who's been exposed. What it looks like at 30 minutes, at 60, at 90. She sat down across from him and pulled the laptop toward her. She wrote for 11 minutes without stopping. The words came out in the precise, sequential language of emergency clinical assessment. Not the language of a nursing report, and not the language of a combat medic's field notes, but something that was both, shaped by 16 years of translation between those two registers. She described the initial presentation, the misleading recovery window, the cardiovascular signature, the capillary refill timing, the specific quality of the pallor. She described what Torres's trace had looked like during the 4 difficult minutes, and what that looked like compared to a standard cardiac event, and why the distinction mattered for treatment. She noted the antidote, the dosing, the monitoring protocol. When she slid the laptop back to Fourier, he read it in silence, and she watched his eyes move through it with the speed of someone reading for operational content rather than comprehension. "This is good," he said. That was all. He sent it. To whom, and through what channel, she didn't ask, and he didn't say. But within 20 minutes, his radio produced a confirmation from Reyes that 3 hospitals along the Billings corridor had been contacted through federal public health emergency protocols and were receiving the clinical guidance. She sat back in the chair and felt the particular exhaustion of sustained focus beginning to cost her something, which was a sign that the immediate emergency had moved to a different phase. Not over. Different. "Tell me about Garrett Polk," she said. Fourier looked up from the laptop. "That's outside the scope of... Is he dead?" A pause. "Yes," Fourier said. "He was found in the cab. It was not a traffic fatality." She absorbed that. "He was carrying a compound that could kill people," she said. "And someone killed him. So either he was a loose end or he was in the wrong place. Or Ms. Voss. Or there's a third truck," she said. "The manifest said fleet of 4. You found 2. One is missing a container. Where's the 4th? Fourier looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was, she thought, close to something she might have called respect if she'd been inclined to read it generously. "We're working on that," he said, which was the same thing he'd said about the missing container, and which she understood now was not evasion, but simply the honest answer when you were 3 hours into an operation that kept revealing new floors. She went back to the floor. She checked Jackson first, then Torres, then Weiss. Jackson was awake and asking about food, which was one of the better signs she'd seen all day. Torres was stable but needed another several hours of monitoring. Weiss had been cleared to have his wife come in, and they were sitting together in Bay 4 with the specific quiet of 2 people who have been reminded of something they were in the middle of forgetting. Aldridge found her at the workstation at 4:10. He had the look of someone who had spent the last 2 hours in conversations they found unpleasant and was arriving at the far end of that experience with less certainty than they'd carried into it. "Marlene wants a meeting," he said. "All 3 of us. Her office, 5 o'clock. "What's the agenda?" "Officially, it's a review of today's clinical decisions." He paused. "I think the unofficial agenda is that she wants to understand what she's dealing with before the federal situation develops further." "What does she think she's dealing with?" Aldridge looked at her with the candor that difficult days sometimes produce in people who spend most of their time managing impressions. "An employee she doesn't have a complete file on, in the middle of a federal investigation, who made 2 significant unauthorized clinical calls today. One of which saved 3 lives. "Yes," he said. "That's the complication." She thought about the meeting. She thought about Oakes and the attorney with the leather folio, and she thought about what she did and didn't want to say in a room that would have institutional memory of the conversation. "Fine," she said. 5 o'clock. She had 40 minutes. She used 20 of them to sit in the break room and not do anything, which she almost never did. She sat with a glass of water and let the day so far exist in her head without trying to organize it. Jackson's blue lips. Torres and the 4 bad minutes. Fourier's face when she'd told him about the village. The word classified hanging in the conference room air like it was load-bearing. She thought about the second deployment. She thought about it more specifically than she usually allowed herself to, which was to say, she let herself see it. The forward operating base, the particular quality of the light in that part of the world at that time of year, the way the village had looked when the reports came in and she'd gone out with the response team because that was her job. The civilians. The two they'd lost. The report she'd written that used the words probable contamination event because those were the words her commanding officer had told her to use, and she had been 29 years old and she had used them. She had thought about that report a lot in the years since. Not every day. She'd gotten it below the threshold of every day, but enough that she knew exactly where it lived in her, which was somewhere behind her sternum, in a place that didn't have a better anatomical name. She had not been able to confirm what she suspected. She had not had the standing or the access or the institutional backing to confirm it. She had written probable contamination event and signed it and watched it disappear into the processing machinery of an organization that was very good at making things disappear. 16 years later, a 7-year-old boy had sat down in her waiting room with the same pattern of symptoms, and she had known what it was before she had words for why she knew. She finished the water and went to Oakes's office. The meeting was, as predicted, uncomfortable. Oakes was professional and thorough and asked questions with the care of someone who was building a record in real time. The attorney took notes. Aldridge sat to one side with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided that his clearest path through the situation was to say as little as possible. Oakes asked about the decision to administer the antidote without a toxicology consult. Nora answered that. Oakes asked about the decision to proceed with treatment for Torres before authorization had been formally confirmed. Nora answered that too. Oakes asked about the meetings with federal agents and whether Nora had shared patient information in those conversations. I shared clinical information about the compound and the symptom cluster, Nora said. Not patient-identifying information. I was careful about that. Were you? It was not quite a question. Yes. And the information you shared about the compound, where did that knowledge come from? Clinical experience. Could you be more specific? Nora looked at her. I served as an Army combat medic for 8 years. The clinical experience includes events during that service. Oakes absorbed this. She looked at the attorney briefly, and something passed between them that Nora couldn't fully read. That information, Oakes said carefully, doesn't appear in your employment file. No. Why not? It wasn't asked for. Your onboarding process asks for nursing credentials, employment history in civilian medicine, and 3 references. I provided all of those. She kept her voice level. There's no checkbox for military service in your paperwork, Administrator Oakes. I checked. A silence. That may need to change, Oakes said, which was neither an accusation nor an apology and therefore felt like both. The meeting ended without resolution, which Nora had anticipated. Oakes wanted more time to consult with the attorney, with the hospital board, with whoever she needed to consult with. Aldridge said he'd be in touch. The attorney closed the folio. She was in the corridor outside Oakes's office when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, which in other circumstances she would have ignored. Need you back. Bay 2. She went. Jackson was not in Bay 2. The gurney was still there, pushed to the side, with the monitors disconnected in the way that indicated a planned transfer rather than an emergency exit. Priya was at the doorway. He was moved to pediatric observation, Priya said. About 20 minutes ago. He's fine. She paused. But there's something else. There's a man in the corridor who says he's Jackson's father. He came in about 40 minutes ago. He's been asking a lot of questions. What kind of questions? About who treated Jackson. About what medication was given. About the federal agents. Priya's voice was careful. He has a visitor's badge. Aldridge approved it. But Nora, she lowered her voice. He doesn't look like a car accident. He looks like someone who drove here from somewhere else very fast. Nora moved to the corridor. The man was standing near the intake desk with his back slightly to the wall, which was not the posture of a frightened father. He was 40, maybe 45, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that was specific enough to be deliberate. Average height, average build, clothes that said nothing about him. He was holding a visitor badge and looking at his phone. He looked up when she came around the corner, and for just a fraction of a second, Before the expression settled into something appropriately parental, there was an assessment. Fast, professional, the kind you didn't learn in a parenting class. She had seen that look before. She stopped at the intake desk, said something to Priya about a chart update she didn't actually need, and took out her own phone. She sent a text to the number that had texted her. Man in ER corridor claiming to be Jackson's father. Doesn't read right. Can you confirm the family contact from Route 9? The response came back in under 90 seconds. Jackson's father is David Briggs, currently en route from Kalispell. ETA 45 minutes, not at your facility yet. She read it twice. The man in the corridor looked up from his phone again, and this time his eyes went directly to her, and she understood two things simultaneously, that he had read her reading him, and that he had made a decision about how to handle that. He took one step toward her, and from the main entrance, 40 feet away, the doors opened, and Fourier came through them with Reyes beside him and two other individuals she hadn't seen before. Not suited, not casual, something in between, with the particular combination of alert and contained that she was very tired of being the only person in this building who could read. The man in the corridor turned toward the entrance. For a moment, the four of them, Fourier, Reyes, and the two others, were visible to the man, and the man was visible to Nora, and she saw him make the calculation in real time, the same way she'd seen soldiers make calculations in the fraction of a second before a situation changed from manageable to not. He moved, not running. That was the thing. He didn't run because running was conspicuous, and he was someone who had been trained not to be conspicuous. He moved at the speed of a man with a purpose, angling toward the corridor that led to the secondary stairwell, which she knew led to pediatric observation, and she understood that understanding had to be communicated in the next 4 seconds, or it would be too late. She stepped directly into his path. Not physically blocking him. She wasn't built for that, and wasn't stupid enough to try. Just stepping into his line, forcing a choice, buying the 3 seconds it took for Fourier to read the situation from across the room. The man stopped. He looked at her. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was perfectly controlled. "Jackson's in pediatric observation," she said. "Second floor. But visiting hours don't start for another hour, and they'll need to verify your ID at the nurse's station up there." She held his eyes. He held hers. "Of course," he said. He turned and walked toward the main entrance, and as he did, Fourier angled to intercept, and Reyes went wide. And what happened in the next 30 seconds involved a controlled conversation near the main doors that she watched from the intake desk, and that ended with the man being accompanied out by Reyes and one of the others. Fourier came back to her. "How did you know?" he said. "He had a visitor's badge. Aldridge approved it." She looked at him. "But when he looked at me the way people do when they've already assessed whether you're a problem. Visitors don't do that. They're too worried about their sick kid." Fourier was quiet for a moment. "He's connected to the third truck," he said. It was not a question. "I don't know what he is," she said. "But he wasn't Jackson's father." "No." He glanced toward the exit. He wasn't. The next hour had a quality she recognized from certain operational contexts. The hours when the timeline of an event compressed, when things that should have taken days began happening in accelerated sequence because someone had made a decision somewhere upstream that the situation needed to move. Fourier got a call at 5:50 that he took in the corridor without trying to step away. She heard pieces of it: confirmed federal credentials, procurement office in Denver, 3 names flagged, 2 of them currently unaccounted for. He was on for 4 minutes. When he came back, the expression he brought with him was different. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that she read as the specific kind of urgency that comes with a clock that's now visible. "The Denver office," he said. "You were right about it." She had said nothing about Denver. She'd heard him on the radio earlier. "What did you find?" 3 employees. 1 is the contractor in the cab, Polk. 1 is the man we just removed from your facility, whose real name we're working on. The 3rd is a woman named Cheryl Tarrant, who appears to be the administrative processing point for the contractor IDs. He paused. Tarrant submitted a request 4 days ago through an internal emergency management channel. Request was flagged as routine, got buried. We found it tonight. What was the request? She was trying to report something. She used the wrong channel, and it went nowhere. He looked at her directly. She's currently not responding to contact. What was she trying to report? A shipment. 4 trucks, cargo listed as industrial equipment, routing through Montana. He paused. She noted that the cargo manifest didn't match the procurement records. She thought it was a billing discrepancy. Nora sat with that for a moment. A federal employee who thought she was reporting a paperwork problem had, without knowing it, triggered the chain of events that ended with a 7-year-old boy in a waiting room in Deadweight. Because someone had been moving something through the supply chain infrastructure of a federal agency, using real credentials, hiding in the noise of a procurement office where nobody looked too carefully at the paperwork. "This is not a small operation," she said. "No." "The compound wasn't being transported," she said slowly, building it out as she spoke. "It was being delivered. The Route 9 accident didn't expose the operation. It interrupted a delivery." Fourier was watching her with the expression of someone who has already arrived at this conclusion and is watching someone else arrive at it in real time. "Delivered where?" she said. "That's what we're working on." "The 4th truck," she said. "Yes." "If it reaches its destination—" "It won't," he said. But the way he said it had just enough tension in it that she heard what lived behind the certainty. At 6:15, her phone rang. Not a text, a call, from a number in the hospital's internal directory that she didn't immediately recognize. She answered. "This is Nora Voss." The voice on the other end was female, quiet, with the compressed quality of someone speaking in a space where they're not sure who can hear. "I don't know who to call," the voice said. "Someone gave me this number. They said you'd understand." A pause. "My name is Cheryl Tarrant." Nora's hand tightened on the phone. "Ms. Tarrant," she said, keeping her voice even. "Where are you right now?" "I'm in my car. I've been driving since this morning. I don't—" The voice broke slightly, then steadied. "I found something 3 days ago, in the system. I tried to report it, and nothing happened. And then yesterday, 2 men came to my office who said they were there for a routine audit, and I knew—" She stopped. "I just knew." "Are you safe right now?" "I think so. I don't know." "Can you tell me where you are?" A pause. "I think I'm about 40 miles from Deadweight," Tarrant said. "I've been driving toward the hospital because I didn't know where else to go. I have files. I have everything about the shipment and where it was going and who authorized it." Her voice dropped further. "I know what's in those trucks. I know what it's for." Nora was already standing up, already looking for Fourier, who was across the room with his back to her. "Ms. Tarrant," she said, "stay on the line with me. Don't stop driving." She crossed the room toward Fourier, phone at her ear, the other hand already raised to get his attention, before she'd finished covering the distance. Because whatever was in those trucks, and wherever they were going, Cheryl Tarrant was 40 miles out and alone, and the only person who knew all of it. And someone had already killed one person today to keep that information from reaching exactly this moment. Fourier turned. She handed him the phone, and while he took it and identified himself and began the rapid coordination of getting Tarrant from 40 miles out to somewhere that had walls and witnesses around it, Nora stood in the emergency department corridor of Harlow County Regional Hospital and felt the specific weight of a thing that had started with a child's blue lips and had grown, in the space of 8 hours, into something she didn't yet have the full shape of. What she knew was this: the compound existed. The delivery was real. The network behind it had federal credentials and shell procurement structures and enough operational patience to build a cover identity over 18 months. And somewhere between Billings and a destination that still didn't have a name in her understanding of this, a 4th truck was moving. Fourier was speaking into her phone in the rapid, specific shorthand of someone deploying resources. Behind her, she heard the elevator open. She turned. Coming out of the elevator was a man she had not seen before, tall, in civilian clothes that fit the way clothes fit people who spend time in uniforms, with a federal ID already in his hand and another man with him who was not an agent. The second man was older. He was wearing a suit. He had the particular kind of face that people develop when they've spent a long time in rooms where decisions are made and consequences are managed, and the expression on that face was directed at Fourier. Fourier saw them, and his body changed posture. Not deferential, not alarmed, but aware in the specific way of someone who has just understood that the level above them has entered the room. The older man in the suit looked at Fourier. Then he looked at Nora. "You're the nurse," he said. "I am." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile. the expression of someone taking an accurate inventory. "I've read what you wrote," he said, "about the compound, about the symptom progression." He paused. "Who told you what to look for?" "Nobody told me," she said. "I recognized it." "From where?" She looked at him steadily. "From a village I'm not supposed to remember." This corridor was very quiet. The older man in the suit held her eyes for a long moment, and in his expression, underneath the professional composure, she saw something move. Something that looked in the particular way of a man who has spent a long time managing information, like the expression of someone who has just confirmed something they already knew was true but had been hoping was not. "We have a problem," he said quietly, "bigger than the truck." And from the phone in Fourier's hand, Cheryl Tarrant's voice came through, thin, compressed, suddenly urgent. "There's a car behind me. It wasn't there before. It's been following me for—" The line went dead. Fourier hit redial before the echo of Tarrant's last word had finished moving through the corridor. It rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail. No name, just a tone, and he pulled the phone away from his ear and looked at it with the controlled expression of someone doing rapid triage on a situation that has just changed its shape. The older man in the suit, whose name Nora would learn in the next 4 minutes, was Deputy Director Warren Holt, out of a federal oversight division whose exact title she'd never heard spoken aloud, was already on his own phone, speaking in a low, clipped cadence that indicated he was talking to someone with the authority to move resources fast. "I need a patrol unit on Route 12 southbound between mile marker 40 and Delwood city limits," he said. "White female, driving alone, vehicle unknown. She may be in distress." A pause. "Now, not when someone has a minute." Fourier turned to Reyes, who had come back inside. "Get back on 12. Drive it north and call me when you have eyes on anything." Reyes was already moving. Nora stood in the corridor and felt the specific uselessness of having no role in the next 15 minutes. The search would happen, or it wouldn't, and there was nothing she could do from the interior of a hospital to influence it. This was a feeling she had managed before, in different settings, and she had never found a clean resolution to it. You just waited and kept your hands busy with whatever was in front of you. What was in front of her was Jackson Briggs, who was in pediatric observation on the 2nd floor and whose actual father was, according to Fourier's earlier text, still 40-odd minutes out from Delwood. She took the elevator up. The pediatric observation unit at Harlow County Regional was quieter than the emergency department. Lower ceilings, softer lighting, a nurse's station that had a handmade paper banner near the desk that read, "You are brave in careful block letters, clearly made by a child at some earlier point." Jackson was in the 2nd room, in a bed that was slightly too big for him, watching something on a tablet that the floor nurse had apparently lent him. His color was better. Not normal, not the normal of a healthy 7-year-old, but better in a way that was legible and genuine. He looked up when she came in. "You came back," he said. "I said I would." He considered this, then returned to the tablet. She sat in the chair beside the bed and checked his monitor. Sat 95, heart rate normal, rhythm clean, and then sat back and let herself exist in the quieter register of this room for a moment. "My dad's coming," Jackson said, without looking up. "I know. About an hour. He's going to be really loud when he sees me. He gets loud when he's scared." He paused. "He's not mean. He's just loud." "That's okay. Do you have kids?" "No." He seemed to accept this without judgment, the way children accept facts. "My mom would have been loud too," he said, "but she died 2 years ago." Nora sat with that for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded with the particular gravity of a child who has heard that phrase many times and has developed a relationship with it. "It's okay. My dad's better now. He was really bad for a while, but he's better." She stayed for 12 minutes. She didn't talk much, and he didn't seem to require it. When the floor nurse came in to check his IV, Nora stood and told Jackson she'd see him again before his father arrived. She went back downstairs. The situation in the corridor had shifted in the particular way that situations shift when decisions have been made in the room you weren't in. Holt was off his phone. Fourier was at the workstation, looking at a screen she couldn't see the angle of. The second man who'd come up in the elevator with Holt, younger, quiet, who had not been introduced and who had not introduced himself, was standing near the entrance doors. Reyes called it 7:04. She heard Fourier's side of it. "Where exactly?" What condition? Is she talking? A pause. Okay, don't move her. Get the paramedics there now and call me when you're rolling. He put the phone down and looked at Holt. She's off the road. Her car went into the ditch on 12, about 32 miles out. Reyes says she's conscious, possible head injury, airbag deployed. He paused. There's no other vehicle at the scene. She lost control, Holt said. Her tire is flat, rear driver's side. Reyes says it looks like it wasn't a blowout. A beat. Get her here, Holt said. He said it to Fourier, and then he turned and looked at Nora, and she understood that the glance was not incidental. He was calculating her role in the next phase, the way he had been calculating it since he stepped off the elevator. The files she mentioned, Nora said. Did she have them with her? We don't know yet. If they were in the car and someone ran her off the road, we're aware of that, Holt said. Reyes is checking the vehicle. She thought about what Tarrant had said on the phone. I have everything. Everything about the shipment and where it was going and who authorized it. The word authorized had landed with a particular weight when she'd heard it, because authorization meant paperwork, and paperwork meant names, and names in an operation of this scope meant that the conspiracy had a human architecture that could be mapped and dismantled, but only if the paperwork still existed. Tarrant arrived at Harlow County Regional at 7:41, in the back of a county ambulance, with a laceration above her right ear, a probable mild concussion, and a laptop bag that Reyes had found wedged under the front passenger seat, which he had removed from the vehicle before the flatbed arrived, and which he had brought with him in a sealed evidence bag. Nora was not present for the intake. That was Cassidy's territory, and she let it be. But she was in the corridor when the gurney rolled through, and she got a clear look at Cheryl Tarrant for the first time. Tarrant was in her mid-40s, with the look of someone who had been professional and composed for a very long time, and had been running on the last reserves of that composure for the past several hours. She was conscious and clearly frightened, and had the expression of someone who has made a decision that cannot be undecided and is living with the weight of that. There was blood in her hair on the right side. She was holding the strap of the laptop bag with both hands, which was a detail that meant something. She was handed off to Cassidy. But as the gurney moved past Nora, Tarrant's eyes found her. The specific, searching look of someone who has been given a name and is trying to match it to a face. Voss? She said. Yes. He said I could trust you. Who did? But the gurney was past her. Cassidy was talking, and Tarrant's attention was pulled forward into the bay. Nora stood in the corridor and thought about that sentence for a moment. He said I could trust you. Who had given Tarrant her name and her number? Not Fourier. She'd sent him the text, not the other way around. Not Reyes. Not Holt, whom she'd met approximately 40 minutes ago. She went to find Fourier. He was in the conference room with the laptop open and Holt beside him, both of them looking at the screen. She came in without knocking, which she'd stopped bothering to do approximately 3 hours ago, and asked the question directly. Who gave Tarrant my contact information? Fourier looked up, then he looked at Holt. Holt's expression was the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for a question and has prepared an answer that is accurate but not complete. We reached out to her this afternoon, Holt said, after we identified the Denver connection. We told her there was a nurse at Harlow County Regional who had identified the compound, who had military medical background, and who was already cooperating with the investigation. You used me as bait, Nora said. We used you as a point of trust. She needed a reason to go somewhere. He paused. It worked. She stood in the doorway and processed this with the specific irritation of someone who has been managed without being asked. It was not unfamiliar. It was in fact an experience she had a long history with, going back to a time when she'd been 29 and had written probable contamination event on a report that then went somewhere she was never allowed to follow it. What's on the laptop? She said. Fourier turned the screen toward her. It was a procurement database, the kind of internal system that large federal agencies use to track equipment acquisition, vendor relationships, and supply chain logistics. She was not familiar with the specific interface, but the structure was recognizable. Columns for vendor name, cargo description, transport routing, authorization codes, and a final column headed Approved By. The entries on the screen were from the past 8 months. There were 37 of them. 37 transport authorizations, all routing through Montana, Wyoming, or Idaho, all listing cargo as industrial equipment or cleaning supplies, all approved by an authorization code that resolved at the top of the visible chain to a name she didn't recognize. A name attached to a division that Holt had to explain to her was a legacy procurement infrastructure that had been technically dissolved 3 years ago, but whose authorization codes had never been deactivated. Somebody used a ghost structure, she said. Yes. To move material through legitimate federal channels without any active oversight. Yes. She looked at the screen. 37 shipments. The compound in those trucks had not appeared in a vacuum. It had a supply chain, a testing history, a distribution infrastructure. The Route 9 accident had not been the beginning of this. It had been, at most, one shipment in a program that had been operating for most of a year. Who's at the top? She said. The real authorization, behind the ghost codes. Holt looked at her for a moment. That's what we're working on, he said, which was the third time she'd heard that phrase today, and it had a different quality each time. The first time it had meant we're doing what we can. The second time it had meant we're closer than we were. This time it meant something she couldn't fully read. Terrence said she knows where the shipment was going, Nora said. Destination. Did she? We haven't been able to debrief her yet. Fourier looked at the evidence bag on the table beside the laptop. The files on the physical drive are encrypted. We're working on access. Can I talk to her? Both men looked at her. She said she trusted me, Nora said. That's not nothing. Right now she's in a hospital bay with a head injury, and she's frightened, and the people she works for may have just tried to kill her. I'm not an agent, and I'm not her lawyer, and that might be exactly why she'll talk to me. Another of the pauses that had come to define her relationship with these two men. The pauses where they weighed her against the variables she couldn't see. 5 minutes, Holt said. Tarrant was in Bay 6, sitting up with a bandage at her hairline and the careful eyes of someone who has had their bell rung but is managing to function. Cassidy had cleared a concussion and recommended observation. She had already declined twice to let the floor staff take the laptop bag. Nora came in, moved a chair to beside the bed, and sat down. How's your head? She said. It hurts. Terrence's voice was steadier than it had been on the phone. I've had worse. What happened on the road? I don't know exactly. I heard something from the rear of the car, and then the handling went wrong and I overcorrected, went off the edge. She was matter-of-fact about it in the way of someone who is keeping the feeling of it at arm's length for now. Someone was following me. I saw headlights. The agents found your car. They have the bag. Tarrant looked in the evidence bag that Reyes had set just inside the doorway, and something in her expression loosened slightly. Not relief, but the recalibration of someone whose primary concern has shifted from the object to what the object contains. Everything is in there, she said. The procurement records go back to last February. The vendor registration, the cargo manifests, the internal routing approvals, all of it. She paused. And the destination. What's the destination? Tarrant looked at her hands for a moment, then back up. There's a research facility outside a town called Garvey, about 60 miles north of Delwood. It's listed in the Federal Property Database as a decommissioned agricultural testing site. It was supposed to be inactive. She stopped. It's not inactive. Nora held still. The fourth truck, Tarrant said quietly. The one they haven't found. It's not going to a warehouse. It's going to Garvey. And whatever they're planning to do with what's in it, she looked at the door, then back. The procurement order for that shipment included specifications I've never seen before. Environmental dispersal modeling, wind pattern analysis for a specific geographic radius. She met Nora's eyes. They're not storing it. They're testing it. The word testing sat in the bay like something physical. Nora thought about a village she wasn't supposed to remember. 2 people she wasn't supposed to have lost. A report she wasn't supposed to challenge. People lived in Garvey, Tarrant said. The town is small, maybe 400 people. But it's there. It's occupied. Nora stood up. She went to the doorway, picked up the evidence bag, and carried it to the conference room. What happened in the next 90 minutes did not happen smoothly, and that was perhaps what she remembered most clearly afterward. Not the outcome, but the friction of it. The encrypted drive took 40 minutes to access, during which Holt made 4 phone calls that went up a chain of authority she couldn't map from the outside. The data, when it finally opened, required interpretation by people who understood procurement database structures. And for 20 minutes, there were three people talking over each other about what a specific authorization field meant, and nobody could agree. She stayed in the room and kept her mouth shut, because the thing she understood and they were still arriving at was that the destination file was not encrypted. It was in a folder labeled Logistics Appendix that Tarrant had apparently saved separately and simply, in the way of someone who worked in administrative systems and knew how to preserve a document without a technical background. She found it herself, while the others were arguing. She put it on the screen. The room went quiet. The file was a site assessment. The decommissioned facility outside Garvey, with coordinates, building schematics, and a document labeled Phase 3 Protocol. She didn't read the full document. She read enough. The fourth truck is the delivery vehicle for an aerosolized dispersal test, she said. The facility has been retrofitted. The dispersal is designed to be contained within the property boundary, but the environmental modeling they did accounts for wind patterns that carry material outside that boundary. She looked at Holt. The town is downwind. Holt was already on his phone. From that point, the operational machinery moved in ways that she was partly inside and partly watching from the edges. Holt's calls went up to a level that resulted, within 30 minutes, in a federal emergency response order for the Garvey facility and a coordinated intercept for the fourth truck on its most probable route. She was not part of those calls. She was not part of the tactical decisions. She sat in the conference room and answered questions when questions were directed at her. About the compound, about the symptom progression, about what a dispersal event affecting a town of 400 people would look like in clinical terms. And she answered them with the directness and precision that she had always brought to problems where the answer mattered more than the impression. At 9:22, Reyes called in. The fourth truck had been intercepted on a county road 12 miles north of Deadweight, approximately 18 miles short of Garvey. The driver had not resisted. The cargo was intact. The room received this information with the controlled exhale of people who have been holding something without fully acknowledging they were holding it. Nora sat back in her chair. She thought about Garvey, which she had never been to, and its 400 residents, who had gone about their Tuesday without any awareness that the day had contained the shape of a different outcome. She thought about a family eating dinner, or a kid doing homework, or someone sitting on a porch watching the dark come in over the flatland. None of them would ever know. That was not a small thing. At 10:15, Marcus Aldridge knocked on the conference room door. She looked up. He came in, and he looked like a man who had spent the day in a building where things he didn't understand had been happening around him, and who had arrived at the end of that day in a condition of considerable humility. The hospital board called an emergency meeting, he said. Administrator Oakes is presenting the day's events, he paused. They're discussing your position. Okay, she said. Nora. He stopped. She could see him working toward something in the specific way he'd been working toward things all day. Finding the angle, finding the language. Only this time, the thing he was working toward was not a way to manage her. I blocked you on 3 separate occasions today. I told you to wait for the consult. I told you not to administer the medication. I told you that you were overstepping. Yes, she said. I was wrong. It was 4 words and it cost him something to say them, which she could see. She did not perform magnanimity about it because the situation didn't call for performance. You authorized the medication, she said. That's what mattered. Only after, I know, but you did it. She looked at him directly. That's the part that went in the chart. He stood in the doorway for another moment, and she thought he was going to say something else, but he didn't. He went back out. Holt came in at 10:40 and sat across from her for the first time without the operational urgency of the previous several hours. He had the look of a man allowing himself 1 minute of not being in motion. The facility outside Garvey, he said. We're executing a search warrant. We'll have people on the ground within the hour. What will you find there? Based on the procurement records, laboratory infrastructure, additional compound stockpile, and documentation of what appears to be at least 2 previous tests, he paused. Not in Montana. The village. She didn't say it. She didn't need to. The authorization chain, she said. You said you were working on it. We have a name, he said. We had it about an hour ago. I couldn't confirm it before. Who? He held her eyes. A man named Bernard Cray, he said. Deputy Procurement Director for the division that the ghost authorization codes trace back to. He retired 14 months ago. 6 months after he retired, the shipment started. He set it up before he left. He set up the infrastructure, then walked away from it, so there was no active employee footprint. Holt's expression had the flat, careful quality of someone who has found something they were looking for and is not celebrating. He's been contracting for 3 separate private defense firms since his retirement. All of them have interests in chemical deterrent development. He was testing a product, Nora said, for buyers. That's the working hypothesis. And Garrett Polk and the man who came to the hospital, were they his contractors? Polk was. The man at the hospital. He paused. His name is James Stroud. He has a prior federal employment record, then a gap of about 5 years, then recent contractor work for one of the same firms Cray works for. He's in custody. He's not talking yet. He will, she said. She didn't say it as optimism. She said it as assessment. Holt looked at her for a moment. You don't work for us, he said. No. You were a combat medic. I was. What made you stay? He said it without a particular inflection. Not challenge, not flattery. Genuine question. She thought about it honestly, which was not the same as thinking about it quickly. I couldn't fix what happened in the field, she said. Not after the fact. In a hospital, you can at least see what you're doing. He nodded once, as if this was an answer he understood. Cray is in Washington, he said. We're coordinating an arrest with the field office there. It'll happen tomorrow morning. Before he knows the truck was intercepted? We believe so. We've been careful about what's been on open channels tonight. She thought about the operational chain, all the radio calls she'd heard, the phones, the frequency cycling on the equipment in the conference room. Careful, but not airtight. Nothing was airtight. What about Aldridge, she said. Holt frowned slightly. The physician? He tried to slow me down today at every point. I want to understand if that was just institutional hierarchy or if there's something else. Holt was quiet for a moment. His file is clean, he said. He's not connected to this. He went through the right channels to approve the impersonator's visitor badge. That's not nothing. He approved it because the man presented a legitimate-looking ID and a cover story about being the boy's father. Holt met her eyes. Aldridge was managed, not complicit. She sat with that. Managed. She understood the distinction. It was not entirely comfortable, but it was real. The board meeting, she said. What's going to come out of it? Holt's expression moved into something that was not quite a smile and not quite the opposite. I've already spoken to Administrator Oakes, he said, unofficially. What did you tell her? I told her that the clinical decisions made today by your charge nurse were directly responsible for saving 3 lives and enabling a federal response that prevented a mass casualty event in a residential area. He paused. I also told her that the charge nurse's military background, which should have been known to the department, informed those decisions at every critical moment. That last part wasn't meant as a compliment, she said. No, he agreed. It wasn't, but it landed like one. Her phone buzzed. A text from the pediatric floor. Jackson's father is here. He's asking for you. She stood up. I need to go upstairs, she said. Holt nodded. She moved toward the door, and he said her name once, Ms. Voss. And she turned. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has spent a career in federal oversight and has developed a particular regard for people who do the right thing in conditions that make it structurally difficult. The report from your second deployment, he said. The one about the contamination event. She went still. We found it, he said, in an archive that was supposed to have been sealed. And? And it's not the only document in that file. He held her eyes. There are internal communications from the period immediately following your report, from people in oversight positions at the time. He paused. They knew what you suspected. They chose not to pursue it. The corridor outside the conference room had the particular quiet of a hospital late at night. Monitors, footsteps, the distant sound of a cart being wheeled somewhere. She stood in the doorway and let the information find its place in her understanding of the past 16 years, which it did with the specific weight of something that had been waiting a long time to land. Who were they? She said. Holt looked at her. That's what we're still working on, he said. And this time the phrase had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not evasion, not operational caution, but something that sounded precisely and unmistakably like the beginning of something that was not finished. She went upstairs. Jackson's father was a stocky man in his early 40s with the face of someone who had driven 4 hours on adrenaline and arrived at the destination to find his son alive and smaller than he'd feared. He was standing beside the bed when she came in, with one hand on Jackson's shoulder. And when he turned to look at her, his eyes had the raw, slightly unfocused quality of a man who has done the calculation and found that it came out in his favor and has not yet fully processed what that means. "You're the nurse," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "Jackson told me you sat with him," he said. "When he was—" He stopped. "You stayed." "I did." He nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then he looked back at his son, and whatever he was going to say stayed where it was. She understood that too. She checked Jackson's monitor one last time. Sat 96. Heart rate clean. The color in his face was the color of a child who is going to be fine. She said goodnight to Jackson, who said goodnight back with the directness of a child who considers this a reasonable exchange between people who have understood each other. She took the elevator down. In the lobby, she passed Priya at the end of her shift, and they didn't say much because there wasn't much that needed saying. She got her jacket from the break room. She walked down the main corridor toward the exit. Aldridge was at the workstation, doing something on the computer, and he looked up when she passed. She stopped. "Board meeting," she said. "How did it go?" He looked at her for a moment. "They're convening a formal review," he said, "of the department's triage protocols and the charge nurse authority structure." He paused. "Oaks wants the review completed within 60 days. What does the review determine?" "Probably that some things need to change." He said it without elaboration. She looked at him. "Aldridge," she said, "that boy is alive because you eventually made the right call. I need you to understand that I know that." He didn't answer immediately. "I made it late," he said. "Yes, but you made it." She walked to the exit. Outside, the Montana night was cold and clear, the way October nights in Deadweight could be. The air with the specific quality of altitude and open space, the sky doing the thing it did out here that it didn't do in cities, which was to simply be enormous and indifferent in a way she had always found, against all reason, steadying. She stood in the parking lot for a moment. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Again. She almost let it go. Then she answered. The voice was male, older, controlled in the way of someone who has spent decades being controlled and has found, tonight, a reason to be less so. "Ms. Voss," the voice said, "my name is Bernard Cray." She stopped moving. "I know who you are," she said. "I expect you do by now." A pause. "I'm calling because I want to speak with someone before the morning, and the people I would ordinarily speak with are no longer available to me." Another pause, with a quality she couldn't quite name. "You wrote a report 16 years ago, about a village." "Yes." "I want you to know," he said, "that the decision to suppress that report was not mine." Her hand was very still on the phone. "Whose was it?" "That's a long list," he said. "But there's one name at the top, a name that isn't in any of the files your people found tonight because the person who put it at the top of that list spent 20 years making sure their name didn't appear in files." A pause. "I can give it to you." The parking lot was very quiet, one car passing on the road outside, the cold air on her face. "Why would you give it to me?" she said. "Because they left me standing in front of this," he said. "The trucks, the facility, the contractor network, they built it with me and they'll walk away from it, the same way they walked away from your village. That's what they do." His voice had the flat quality of a man who has arrived at the end of a long road and found something he didn't expect. "I'm not calling a lawyer, I'm calling you." She stood in the parking lot and looked at the enormous Montana sky. "Tell me the name," she said. The name Bernard Cray gave her was Elaine Marsh. She didn't recognize it immediately, which was the point. Marsh had spent 30 years in federal service in positions that were influential precisely because they weren't visible. Deputy Director of Interagency Coordination, Chair of a Procurement Oversight Subcommittee, Senior Advisor to 2 consecutive administrations on defense contracting reform, which was, Cray explained in the flat voice of a man burning what remained of his professional life to the ground. The most elegant cover imaginable for someone whose actual function was ensuring that certain programs never received the oversight they were legally required to receive. Nora stood in the parking lot and listened. Cray talked for 19 minutes. He talked about Marsh the way people talk about someone they have spent years being afraid of and have decided, at the end of things, to stop being afraid of. He talked about the village, not her village specifically, but the program behind it, which had been running in some form since before Nora had enlisted, which had produced 7 documented exposure events in 4 countries over 14 years, all of them attributed to other causes, all of them managed by a small administrative apparatus that Marsh had built and maintained with the patience of someone who understood that the most dangerous structures are the ones nobody is looking at. He talked about the Route 9 shipment, which was supposed to have been a Phase 3 environmental dispersal test, the last stage before the program's primary contractor presented the compound to a private buyer. He talked about what Garvey had been chosen for: small population, prevailing wind patterns, geographic isolation, and a political footprint small enough that an anomalous health event in the town would have been attributed, as it always was, to something else. He talked about Polk, who had been a contractor for 6 years and had driven 3 previous shipments without incident. He talked about Stroud, who had come to the hospital not because anyone had told him Jackson was a witness, but because Stroud was the operational handler for the program and had been at the Route 9 site when the accident happened and had needed to understand what had been seen and by whom. He talked, and she listened, and she did not make notes because she understood that this conversation was not the record. The record would be made by people with the proper equipment and authority, and her job right now was simply to hold what he was telling her until she could get it to those people. When he finished, there was a silence. "Why me?" she said. "You could have called Fourier directly." "I could have, yeah," he said. "But Fourier is federal, and the people Fourier answers to include individuals whose relationship to Marsh I'm not certain about. You're not in the chain." A pause. "You're just the nurse." He said it without irony, which was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had said to her all day. "Where are you right now?" she said. "Washington. My home." Another pause with the quality of something that has been considered and accepted. "I'm not going anywhere." "I'm going to give your number to Agent Fourier," she said. "Tonight. You should expect a call within the hour." "I know," he said. "And Mr. Cray." She stopped, thought about what she was going to say and whether it served any purpose. Decided it did. "The people in that village, 16 years ago, 2 of them died." A silence. "I know," he said again, and this time the 2 words had a different weight. She hung up. She stood in the parking lot for 30 seconds doing nothing, which was the appropriate response to the previous 19 minutes. Then she went back inside. Fourier was still in the conference room. She handed him the number, told him what Cray had said in the concentrated form of someone delivering a situation report, and watched his expression move through several phases: attention, verification, the controlled recalibration of a man updating a complex picture. He was on his phone to Holt before she finished the last sentence. She went home at 11:40. She drove through Delwood's quiet streets with the heater running and the radio off, and she did not think about anything in particular, which was something she had learned to do after high-intensity days, to let the mind run fallow for the duration of the drive, to not try to organize or process or conclude. The brain did what it needed to do without supervision. She had found this to be true. Her house was a small 2-bedroom on the east side of town that she had owned for 9 years, and that was neither warm nor cold in its character, just hers, full of the particular quiet of a space inhabited by someone who spent most of their waking hours in noise and motion and had made their home into a counterweight. She put her jacket on the hook by the door, filled a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table. She sat there for a while. She thought about the 2 people from the village. She had never known their names. That was one of the ways the military managed things at the field level. You treated the person in front of you, and the paperwork downstream assigned them to a category, and the category didn't require names. She had thought about this many times over 16 years. She thought about it now with the specific texture of someone who has just been told that the thing they suspected was true, which is not the same as relief, is not the same as vindication, but is its own distinct thing. The weight of being right about something you were told you were wrong about. It didn't bring anyone back, but it was real. It was documented. It was, as of tonight, in the hands of people who would do something with it, and the woman who had ensured it remained buried for 16 years was going to have a very different morning than she expected. Nora drank the water and went to bed. She slept for 6 hours, which was more than she expected. Elaine Marsh was arrested at her home in McLean, Virginia, at 6:47 on Wednesday morning, while Nora was making coffee and watching the sky outside her kitchen window turn from gray to a pale, thin blue. The arrest itself was not news yet. It would take until late morning for the information to move through the layers of federal communication into anything resembling a public record. But Fourier texted her at 7:15 with 4 words: "Marsh is in custody." She put the phone down and drank her coffee. Bernard Cray turned himself in to federal authorities at the Washington field office at 8:01 a.m., accompanied by an attorney and carrying, on a USB drive, a set of files that Fourier would later describe to her as the most comprehensive self-incrimination package he had encountered in 11 years of federal investigative work. It included everything: the program's full history, the exposure event documentation, the contractor network, the financial structure, the procurement ghost codes, the identity of every individual with material knowledge of the program's activities. 7 names, including Marsh, who had run it, including 2 individuals who had been in oversight positions during Nora's second deployment and had received her report and had made the decision, documented now, in a memo dated 3 weeks after the village event, that the incident did not warrant escalation. James Stroud remained silent through 48 hours of federal questioning, which his attorney later described as a principled decision and which everyone else understood as the calculation of a man hoping that silence bought him a better deal than talking. It did not. The facility outside Garvey, when federal agents arrived at dawn Wednesday, was not empty. There were 4 individuals on site, one of whom was a chemist with credentials from a legitimate university and a contractor arrangement that had been operating under Marsh's protection for 22 months. The compound stockpile was secured. The dispersal infrastructure, already partially assembled, designed for the test that the Route 9 accident had delayed by approximately 48 hours, was disassembled and removed by a hazmat team that took the better part of 2 days to complete the job. The town of Garvey did not know how close it had come to anything. This was a deliberate choice by the federal response team, and Nora thought about that choice for a long time afterward without arriving at a clean position on it. People had a right to know what had been planned for them. They also had a right not to live with the specific fear of something that had been prevented. She understood both arguments and didn't resolve the tension between them, because some tensions were not built to resolve. She went back to work on Thursday. The department had a different quality to it. Not dramatic, not transformed, but altered in the way of a space where something significant has happened, and the people in it are still finding their position relative to that fact. Priya was at the intake desk when Nora came in, and Priya looked at her with the expression of someone who has spent 2 days fielding questions she didn't have answers to and is relieved to see the person who does. "How are you?" Priya said. "Fine," Nora said. "What does the board look like?" And they went to work. The formal review that Administrator Oakes had ordered completed in 22 days, not 60. Nora thought this was probably a function of external pressure from the federal investigation, which had made Harlow County Regional briefly and uncomfortably prominent in a national story that none of its administrators had wanted to be part of. The review was conducted by an outside consultancy, which interviewed every member of the emergency department staff and reviewed 12 months of clinical decision logs. Its findings were not comfortable reading for anyone who had been in a position of authority on the floor. The report documented 17 instances over the prior 8 months in which charge nurse Nora Voss had flagged a clinical concern to attending physicians that had initially been dismissed and had subsequently proven clinically significant. Not all 17 were as dramatic as what had happened with Jackson. Most were smaller, the ordinary friction of a department where hierarchy and experience didn't always align. But the pattern was there, and the report named it without softening. It also documented the department's onboarding process, which did not ask for military service history, and recommended the change. Aldridge read the report in his office with the door closed and emerged an hour later looking like a man who has had a thorough and private reckoning with something and intends to carry it without performance. He found Nora at the workstation. "I've been asked to respond to the review findings," he said, "in writing, to the board. I wanted you to know that my response is going to be accurate." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I'm not looking to... I just wanted you to know." She nodded. He went back to his office, and she went back to the chart she'd been updating. And that was what accountability looked like in the real world. Not cinematic, not clean, but present. The door going back and forth, the work continuing around it. Oakes called her into her office 2 weeks after the review was released. The attorney was not present this time. The office had the slightly different atmosphere of a meeting that has been prepared differently than the last one. "I'd like to offer you a position," Oakes said. "Emergency Department Quality and Protocol Director. It's a new role. We're creating it as part of the structural response to the review." She paused. "It would give you oversight of clinical protocol development and charge nurse authority guidelines across the department. You'd have a seat at the table when we're making decisions about how the floor functions." Nora sat with this. "Would I still have patient contact?" "We'd build that in. I'm not interested in an administrative role that takes me off the floor." "I know," Oakes said. "That's why I'm offering you a role that doesn't." Nora looked at her. The window behind Oakes's desk showed the parking lot, and beyond it, the flat Montana sky, which was doing its enormous indifferent thing with the same reliability it always did. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for 4 days, which was less time than she'd expected to need. What she was actually thinking about, she realized, was not the title or the expanded authority, but the 17 instances in the report. The pattern. The charge nurses and floor nurses who had raised concerns that had been absorbed by hierarchy without consequence. Not just in this department, but in every department she'd worked in, every clinical setting she'd known. The way that institutional structures generated blind spots, the same way bad road design generated accidents. Not through malice, usually, but through the accumulation of small choices that nobody had examined together. She could examine them now. She had the standing, and she had the specific kind of knowledge that came from having been on the wrong side of those hierarchies for long enough to understand exactly where they failed. She called Oakes on the 4th day and said yes. 6 weeks after that, Cheryl Tarrant testified before a federal oversight committee in a closed session that lasted 2 days. Her testimony, combined with Cray's documentation and the physical evidence from the Garvey facility and the Route 9 vehicles, formed the foundation of a prosecution that named 9 individuals across 3 federal divisions and 2 private defense contracting firms. Elaine Marsh was charged with 12 counts, including conspiracy, obstruction, and violations of federal chemical weapons statutes that carried mandatory minimums. The Attorney General's office was not inclined to negotiate down. She appeared in court in a gray suit with the composed expression of a woman who had spent 30 years in rooms where composure was currency and had not yet fully absorbed the fact that the currency had changed. Her attorney filed 2 motions in the first week. Both were denied. The 7 names from Cray's files were all charged. The 2 individuals who had received Nora's report from the second deployment and buried it, one of them was retired and living in Scottsdale, one of them was still working in a consulting capacity for a private security firm, were among them. The charges in their cases were narrower but real: obstruction, falsification of federal records, knowing participation in the suppression of an incident that had resulted in civilian deaths. Nora was called to give a deposition. She gave it in a federal building in Helena on a Tuesday morning in February, with Fourier present and an attorney the federal prosecutor's office had assigned to walk her through the process. She sat in a chair in a room with a court reporter and described, in sequential clinical detail, what she had observed in a village 16 years ago. The presentation of the civilians, the timeline, the nature of the compound based on what she had observed and what she now understood about it, and the report she had written and what it had said and what she had been told to say. The court reporter typed without expression. The deposition took 3 hours. When it was over, she walked out into the February cold and stood on the steps of the federal building for a moment, and Fourier came out behind her and stood beside her without saying anything, which she appreciated. "How do you feel?" he said, after a while. "Like someone who just told a long story that should have been heard a long time ago," she said. He nodded. "The 2 people who died," she said. "Will their names be in the record? We're working on identifying them through the incident documentation." "That matters," she said. "It should matter." "It does," he said. And this time, coming from him, she believed it. She drove back to Deadweight. Spring came to Montana the way it always did, reluctantly, in fits, with false starts that sent people back inside for their winter coats. The emergency department had the new protocol structure in place by April, And it was not a perfect structure because no structure is, but it was better, and the difference between better and perfect had never seemed like an acceptable excuse to stop at better. She was at the workstation on a Tuesday afternoon in April, reviewing a proposed update to the charge nurse escalation guidelines, when Priya appeared at her elbow. "There's someone asking for you at the front desk," Priya said. "A kid." She looked up. In the waiting room, standing with a woman who was presumably his mother, was Jackson Briggs. He had the look of a child who had been restored to himself. Color in his face, the specific energy of a healthy 7-year-old who has been told to stand still and is managing it imperfectly. He was holding something, which she couldn't see clearly from the workstation. She came out from behind the desk. He saw her, and his face did the uncomplicated thing that children's faces do. It just registered what it felt, which was recognition and relief, and something that was a version of happiness without any of the adult architecture around it. "You're here," he said. "I work here." "I know. I brought you something." He held out what he'd been carrying, a drawing, on white paper folded once. She took it and unfolded it. It was a hospital. Or what a 7-year-old understood a hospital to look like. A blocky building with a red cross on the front, windows drawn as simple squares, and in the foreground, a figure in what she recognized as an attempt at Scrubs, with dark hair and a stethoscope that was slightly larger than the figure's head. Below it, in careful block letters, "The nurse who saw me." She looked at it for a long moment. "I told my art teacher about you," he said. "She said I should draw what I remembered." "This is very good," she said. "The stethoscope is too big." "A little. I wanted it to be obvious what you were." She folded the drawing carefully and held it. His mother, standing a few feet back, had the expression of someone who has been holding a difficult thing together for a long time, and has found, in this moment, a place to set some of it down. "How are you feeling?" Nora asked him. "Normal," he said, with the confidence of a child who has reclaimed the word. "My dad said I was really sick, but I don't really remember it being that bad." "You were pretty sick," she said, "but you fixed it." She looked at him. She thought about what to say, which was a question she rarely had trouble answering and was having a little trouble with now. "You were tough," she said. "That helped." He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "My dad wants to talk to you," he said, a little quieter, like it was something he was disclosing rather than announcing. "He cried when he heard what happened. He doesn't know I know." "I'll talk to him," she said. His mother stepped forward then, and they spoke briefly. The particular brief exchange of two women who understand what they're in the vicinity of and don't need to elaborate it. Jackson's mother thanked her in the direct, unembellished way of someone who has thought about what they wanted to say and decided the simplest version was the truest. Nora accepted it the same way, without deflection, which was something she was still learning to do, to receive things that were given honestly without immediately redirecting them. She walked them out to the lobby. At the door, Jackson turned back once. "The nurse at school told me nurses save more people than doctors," he said. "Is that true?" "Different ways," she said. "Nurses are there more." He thought about this with visible effort, then nodded, apparently satisfied, and went out through the door. She stood in the lobby and watched them go, and the drawing was in her hand, and outside the window the April sky over Deadweight was doing its enormous thing, and she stood there for a moment in the ordinary Tuesday afternoon of a place where she had once been invisible and was no longer. The job had not changed. The waiting room still filled up every morning. People still arrived frightened and in pain, and the system still generated friction at the places where hierarchy met urgency. And there were still days when the right call was the hard call, and the hard call had consequences. This was not going to stop being true. She was not naive about that. But the protocols were different now. The escalation path had changed. When a charge nurse at Harlow County Regional flagged a clinical concern, the framework required a documented response within a defined window, and that response went into a record that was reviewed, and the review went somewhere that someone with authority actually looked at. It was not a revolution. It was a structural change in a mid-sized emergency department in a mid-sized Montana city that affected a limited number of patients every day. She had decided that was enough to be worth doing. She had decided, more broadly, that enough to be worth doing was the standard she wanted to apply. Not the dramatic transformation, not the singular heroic event, but the daily application of what you knew to the problem in front of you, consistently, in the face of the institutional gravity that always pulled toward the path of least resistance. She had spent 16 years making herself smaller than she was. She had called it pragmatism, and sometimes it had been, and sometimes it had just been fear wearing pragmatism's clothes. She understood the difference now more clearly than she had. She did not particularly regret the years. Regret was a type of subtraction, and she was more interested in what remained than in what had been lost. But she was done subtracting. She walked back through the lobby, back through the interior doors, back to the workstation where the protocol update was waiting for her with its particular set of problems that were going to take another hour to work through and would probably need a second revision after that. She sat down, she picked up the pen, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that there is a particular kind of person in every institution, in every hospital, every department, every organization built by human beings with human blind spots, who sees what others don't, who holds the thread others drop, who knows the thing others haven't thought to ask. Usually that person has been overlooked for a long time. Usually the institution has told them in 100 small ways that their seeing doesn't count. They are wrong about that. They are always wrong about that. The only question is how long it takes for the truth to surface. And the truth, she had learned, surfaces. It surfaces through the people who refuse to stop telling it. In waiting rooms, in federal courtrooms, in hospital conference rooms, in cold Montana parking lots at midnight. It surfaces through the people who looked at a child no one was watching and did not look away. It costs something. It always costs something. But it surfaces. She went back to work.